Good evening, scholars, families, and Pinellas County friends. Welcome to Night at the Museum, U.S. History End of Course Exam Review. My name is Matthew Bloom, and I am the High School Social Studies Content Specialist for Pinellas County Schools. Tonight, we are at the Tampa Bay History Center as part of our PCS Connects Level Up initiative. We're joined by Nancy DeLance, the Director of Education here at the museum. Nancy, what can you tell us about the Tampa Bay History Center?
Hello, Matt. We are so happy to work with Matt Bloom and the Pinellas County Schools to help you prepare for the end of course exams. We love U.S. history and know that the more you experience history in novel and unique ways, the more you will enjoy and appreciate it. The Tampa Bay History Center has collected, stored, restored, and exhibited artifacts from our area's history for over 30 years. Tonight's event is virtual, but we hope you will join us soon. Our museum is air-conditioned, clean, and sanitized. We're located on Tampa's beautiful Riverwalk, and we opened in 2009. We have 3 floors of exhibition galleries focusing on 12,000 years of Florida history. We're a Smithsonian affiliate museum and accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. We invite you to come explore our newest permanent exhibit called Treasure Seekers, Conquistadors, Pirates, and Shipwrecks. You will see rare Florida shipwreck artifacts and learn about Florida's maritime history during the Age of Discovery. Tonight, I would also like to thank Dr. Brad Massey, our Saunders Foundation Curator of Public History. He will show you some amazing artifacts, some hidden behind locked doors and some on display in our galleries.
Thank you. And speaking of locked doors, I'm really excited for tonight because we get to go behind the scenes to a place that most visitors don't get to see, which is the collections room, where they keep the artifacts that they end up putting on display here. So let's go check it out and let's meet Brad. So we've made our way down to the collections room and to our content expert for tonight, Dr. Brad Massey. Brad, thanks for letting us come down here and see all these cool things and be in this really neat space.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be hosting y'all today. A lot of people don't get to come back in the collections areas, but we wanted to give everybody a special treat and show them things that we have on permanent display, but also stuff that people just don't get to see.
Well, thank you very much. Before we get into our review, we want to take a look at the content focus for tonight for our scholars. So let's take a look at our benchmarks. We're going to focus on A.6.10, which is to examine the cause, course, and consequence of the early years of the Cold War. We're also going to take a look at A.6.12, which is to examine the causes, course, and consequence of the Korean War. For our scholars at home, it's important that you're listening for things like the overview of the Cold War causes, or the early years of the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, and then we'll wrap it up with causes and some U.S. involvement in the Korean War. If you have questions during the live stream event, remember that you can submit it to the email address pcssocial@pcsb.org. But I want to let you know that not all questions are going to be able to be submitted, but we'll get as many as we can. So let's take a look at the first part of our review. Brad, we want to talk about the Cold War, but to do that, we really need to start with the end of World War II. So what do we need to remember about the end of World War II that's going to set us up for the early years of the Cold War?
Yeah, World War II is obviously such a huge event. We have 16 million Americans approximately that are involved or actually serving in the military during this time. And what the U.S. military planners are doing is they're trying to fight a war where it's going to end in unconditional surrender. And because of that, what we see in Florida in particular, and you're going to see some things roll on the screen that are really Florida specific, is we see a military buildup in Florida. Here in the Tampa area, we're going to have 3 air bases. We're going to have MacDill, we're going to have Henderson, we're going to have Drew airfields, and we're going to have thousands and thousands of service personnel that are going to come here. And so it's a good example, Matt, of how the war effort is really all-encompassing. And so what will happen then is when the war comes to an end, the question becomes, well, what's going to happen to these places? What's going to happen to these 16 million service personnel? And what we see is what we see after most wars, and that's a slow de-escalation of the military. You see military discharges, and then you also see bases that start to close. So for example, those 3 bases here in Tampa, MacDill, Drew, and Henderson are going to close. And then MacDill is still going to be here, and we have some postcards and a lot of cool stuff in our collection that depicts MacDill during the war. But then people are worried because the idea is that, well, the military creates a lot of jobs, and what's it going to look like if we de-escalate? And what people soon realized during the Cold War is it's going to be this very different moment, in that unlike previous American wars where you see basically the military shrinks to very tiny proportions, during the Cold War and after World War II, you're going to still see a military presence. And so, for example, here in Tampa, you're still going to see MacDill Air Base, and it's going to become incredibly important. So what happens during the Cold War is this notion of unconditional surrender starts to go away as the United States is faced with a new enemy when we think about foreign relations.
All right. So with that in mind, or that context to help us, we want to talk about the early years of the Cold War and the idea that the Cold War heats up. So what does that look like in the early years of the Cold War that our scholars need to remember as they're getting ready for their EOC?
Yeah, I think the important thing for them to remember is this. The de-escalation of World War II is going to hit a floor. And what's going to happen is American military planners are going to start to plan for the next war. And they think that war is going to be against the Soviet Union. And one commentator said something really interesting. He goes, never before has a nation won a war and been so insecure afterwards. And the reason that the U.S. Military was so insecure is that it saw the Soviet Union as this threat to American lifeways. And so when it saw the Soviet Union do things like try to blockade Berlin, when it saw the Soviet Union send military forces into Iran, what American military planners decide is that, well, we can't just de-escalate like we used to. We're going to have a standing army, even though that's against American tradition. So in the American tradition, the fear was always that, well, if you have this large standing army, it can then overthrow the civilian-led government at any time. But now that you have the Soviet Union as a threat, there's this concern that, well, we still need people under arms. And so what'll happen is America tries to find this middle ground. This notion of universal military training, that every male should be military trained and be, ready to join the military. We don't quite go there, but we decide we're still going to have a large standing army. And we were just seeing some of the things that we have in our collection. You see that picture of Stalin basically blocking Berlin, and then Stalin getting involved and the Russian army getting involved in Iran. What happens is the United States says, well, we need to contain what the Soviets do. And there's a very important man, a guy by the name of George Kennan, and he's a lower level State Department official, but he comes up with this theory of containment. And the notion is very simple. It's that if we can stop Soviet expansion, and we can stop, in other words, them moving into these countries, especially in Europe, what will happen is we will put pressure on them, and ultimately the Soviet experiment will die out. That's really the hope. And that's really the base of containment. And so what you see is the United States does something that it's really never done in the past, and that's start to throw out huge sums. It's going to be $12 billion that's spent to rebuild Europe under the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan is part of this containment theory. All these things go together, right? Containment, Korea, which we'll talk about. These all are tied to this notion that, well, if we contain the Soviet Union, in order to do that, we're going to have to spend money to rebuild Europe. And then it's also related to the Truman Doctrine. And what Truman is going to do is he's going to spend $400 million to basically prop up what the United States policymakers see as governments that are sympathetic to the United States. So for example, they're going to send money to Greece, the Greece government, so that they'll fight communist rebels. They're going to send money to Turkey to try to basically keep Soviet influence at bay. So what you see then, just to kind of bring it full circle, Matt, is you're going from this notion of unconditional surrender and defeating your enemy on the battlefield completely to this notion of, no, we're not going to go out there and fight a total war, right? There's not going to be a nuclear exchange. What we're going to do is we're just going to try to contain Soviet influence. And for the Soviets, on their side, they see it similar, but they see the United States as the threat that wants to expand out into the globe. So what you see basically are these two spears, these two powerful nations that find themselves at odds. And that's how containment, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine is so much different than unconditional surrender and how World War II gets fought.
And that's great context for the scholars at home listening. When we're reviewing for the EOC, you want to make sure that you're considering the context of the time period, that you're thinking about how events connect together and how they've influenced each other. And so, Brad, thanks for going over containment and the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, but we're in the 1950s. So we're in the early years of the Cold War, And now we're going to get into Korea. So how does this conflict, how do we get into the Korean War? And then really to make a local connection, how do we see local connections from the Korean War to our area?
Yeah. So the way we get into the Korean War is this notion of containment and these limited conflicts. And it doesn't start in Korea. One thing we have in our collection, and we just rolled it on the footage, was you see Stalin basically with a sign that's letting things in and out of Berlin. And so that's one of the United States' first limited conflicts. But that conflict is interesting. It's not a military conflict. What it is Stalin trying to block things getting to Berlin. And so the United States will start an airlift where from 4 airports, there's just 24-hour flights that are taking supplies into West Berlin so it doesn't fall to the Soviets. So that's a containment idea. Funding Greece, rebels that are fighting communists, that's going to be a containment idea. And so then what happens in Korea is we see the same thing play out. And what will happen in Korea is this. North Korean forces with Soviet support are going to come down in and they're going to invade South Korea. And the reason they do that is the nation was divided at the 38th parallel. And one thing we see a lot with containment is we see the United States get involved in these nations that have been divided. Korea is a good example. Vietnam's a good example. Later on, a country that has a parallel, a parallel that's going to divide the nation. And so what happens is after the United States leaves South Korea in roughly 1949, and then the Soviet Union formally leaves North Korea, North Korean forces are going to invade South Korea. And what you'll see then is North Korean forces are going to push all the way into the Korean peninsula, and then American forces are going to push back. And what you see is this give and take. And it's really interesting. One of the things we have in the collection is a pilot that fought during the Korean War. His name was John Jack Bolt. And he fought in both wars. He fought in a war of unconditional surrender, this war in World War II. But then later he's going to fight in the Korean War. And he's really interesting because he's going to fly right near that border with the Chinese, or the border that separates China and North Korea. And the reason that becomes so important, Matt, is long story short, when North Korea invades South Korea, the United States is going to sponsor a counter-invasion that's going to push North Korean forces back to that Chinese border, and that's where Bolt is going to be flying, right around there. And we have his flight log here in the collection. We have some other documents here in the collection. One thing we have is a really interesting card that says, if you run into this airman, and he was given this in case, he crashed or he was found behind enemy lines, it says, if you return him to South Korean or American forces, you will be rewarded. So Bolt, we use his individual experience to tell this story. But getting back to where he's flying, which is incredibly interesting, he's right along the Chinese border. And this is after U.S. forces had landed at Incheon and they pushed North Korean forces back. Chinese forces get very uncomfortable because they think that the U.S. is too close to the border. And what we see is 300,000 Chinese military personnel launch an attack over the border and then push U.S. forces back. So it's a really interesting war when you think about containment. So the United States gets involved initially to say, well, let's contain communism and Stalinism to North Korea. But then when they see the opportunity to push forward, they push close to the border, but then the Chinese are going to push American forces back. So what we see at the end of the day, Matt, is the war ends right along that 38th parallel again. So in a lot of ways, it's a stalemate. So the question of, is it victory? Is it defeat? That's a question that historians have talked a lot about ever since.
Well, great, and thank you. So we've been getting questions from some of the viewers, and we kind of jotted them down real quickly. One of the questions that we got is, and I think you touched on it a little bit, how did the U.S. involvement in the Korean War differ from U.S. involvement in World War II? And I know you mentioned that a little bit, but somebody picked up on that. And what does that look like?
Yeah, I think it's really important. The difference is this. What you're trying to do is contain a political foe. You're not trying to go in and defeat it. The goal isn't to march to Stalingrad. The goal isn't march to St. Petersburg and destroy the Soviet Union like it was during World War II, when the goal is to get to Berlin, right? And then when you get there, Hitler, commits suicide at the end of World War II, but the notion is you're going to get there and you're going to occupy Berlin. It's different, right? For the Korean War, what you want to do is just to keep communist forces at bay where they were before at that 38th parallel. So the goals become very different when you fight these types of wars of containment than when you fight kind of more traditional wars where you want to clear and hold large portions of territory.
So the idea of winning the Korean War, if you're saying that it ends in a stalemate, one of the questions was, did the U.S. win the Korean War? In terms of containment, is that a win? That stalemate a win? What is that? What is the win? Is there a win here when we talk about containment and the Cold War?
Yeah, if you think about containment, it's a win. I mean, what have you done? You saw a force that was supported by the Soviet Union invade South Korea. You responded to that and you pushed that force back. So under containment theory, it's a win. But for a lot of Americans that had fought World War II, like General MacArthur, for him the notion is, no, you go ahead and you pursue the war until you win fully. You know, he was talking about perhaps using nuclear weapons in China, this notion that, well, if the Chinese get involved in the war, we should fight the Chinese army. So that's a different notion of war. But strictly under Keenan's idea of containment, which we talked about at the beginning, the war is a success in that it does contain this communist force that had tried to invade South Korea.
That's super interesting. So one of the other questions that we had that we got in that I think is great is, did involvement in the Korean War, or the way we were involved in Korean War, change how the U.S. approached containment for the remainder of the Cold War?
Yeah, I think it did. I mean, when 300,000 Chinese personnel come over the river into North Korea and push American-led forces, and there were other allies in the war, but it's largely an American force. When they push those forces back, military planners say, well, this is the fear of total war, right? You're going to have two gigantic nations that could even have a nuclear exchange if the Soviet Union gets involved at the time. So what you see is when the United States gets involved in other Asian wars, and that's another important thing about Korea. You know, it shows that the U.S. military is willing to commit forces to the Asian theater. But then when it comes to Vietnam, this notion is, well, we don't want to go too far, right? You don't want to go in and invade North Vietnam because that might get the Soviets involved. That might get the Chinese involved. So when you look at the war in Vietnam, you see these same concerns about, well, we don't want a situation like that again. What we want to do, however, is we want to try to contain the North Vietnamese Communist government to the north and try to keep South Vietnam a free country that's allied with the United States.
That's great. So we want to give the students at home a chance to practice with some of the quick review that we did here. So we've got some questions set up for you all that we're going to give you a minute to be able to join and to practice these multiple choice questions with. And we want to do this through a platform called Nearpod, and most of you are familiar with that. So we're going to put up the code for you all, and we're going to give you about 30 seconds to join. It's really for the students, our scholars at home that are joining us. You can go to join at Nearpod or join.nearpod.com, or you can use the Nearpod app if you have that, scholars. And you're going to use the join code 4BY5X. And we're going to give you a few seconds to be able to join that and get ready. If you're at home and with families and friends and you're not logging in, it's okay, because we're going to be able to show those questions to you on the screen as well so that you can follow along with us and test your knowledge on this quick review that we just did. So we'll give you a few more seconds to join before we get into our first question. All right, so let's get into our first question. If you had a few seconds to join, that's great. If you're worried about dropping the live stream and you just want to participate on your own or with whoever you're sitting with or near, that's fine too. So let's get into the first question. What was a major reason the United States became involved in the Korean War? Was it the threat of communism spreading throughout Asia, a need to prevent war between China and the Soviet Union? Is it a demand by the United States for Korean natural resources, or a desire to limit Japanese expansion? Let's take a look at our answer. So what was a major reason the United States became involved in the Korean War? The answer was A. It was the threat of communism spreading throughout Asia. Remember, we want to be able to connect that back to the idea of containment during this time period. So let's go to our second question. in the long run, what did the United States commit to with the Truman Doctrine? Was it a domestic Red Scare, the economic recovery of Europe, a pledge to fight communism, or the rearming of West Germany? So in the long run, what did the United States commit to with the Truman Doctrine? They committed to a pledge to fight communism. For question 3, in what way did the Korean War mark a turning point in the Cold War? Was it through an increase in U.S. military involvement in Asia? Was it with expanded use of covert operations? By the expansion of NATO in Europe? Or through an increased focus on diplomacy? So to answer this question, you all wanted to think about something that Brad had talked about earlier in the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. We were spending loads of money. In the Korean War, it marked a change because we were doing this through an increased use of military involvement in Asia. And our last question for our practice. According to the theory of containment, if the United States could keep the Soviets from expanding their power, what did the U.S. believe would happen over time? That the Soviet commitment to communism would weaken, that the Soviet system would collapse, that the Soviet military power would decline, that the Soviet Party would rebel against their leaders. So if you got this question right, about the theory of containment and how the United States could keep the Soviets from expanding their power, you had to be paying real good attention to Brad at the beginning when he talked about the fact that the idea is that the Soviet system would collapse if we could effectively commit to containment. So I hope you got every question right. We hope you enjoyed this review. With that practice over, I wanted to remind all of our scholars at home that you have additional opportunities to practice and get ready for the U.S. History end of course exam. And you can do that through what we call the U.S. History Review Center. You can get to this, scholars, by going to Clever. You'll log in with your normal credentials, and you want to find the High School Enrichment Activities app. When you click on that, you'll see a link that says Social Studies, and if you go through that link, it'll take you to the U.S. History Review Center, where there are over 65 review tutorials and videos that we've loaded by benchmark for content covered throughout the year. There's sample assessments written in the EOC format, like the ones you just participated in. There's vocabulary practice games to make sure you understand terms like containment, or the Truman Doctrine, or the Marshall Plan. If you have trouble accessing it on your own, make sure you talk with your U.S. history teacher so that you can find the review center and keep leveling up for the end of course exam. So at this point, Brad, thank you for walking us through the early years of the Cold War. It's a really broad topic, and it's important for the students to remember the context that you helped provided for us, but that they also know some of these specific terms. I want to thank Nancy DeLance, the Director of Education here, and all of the staff at the James Museum for hosting us and letting us take a look inside their collections. We hope you enjoyed the review. We hope you continue to study. Don't forget that next week we have our third stop in Night at the Museum. This time we're coming to you from the St. Petersburg Museum of History. We've got a great topic on Florida during the 1920s. We hope you all have a great night, continue studying, and good luck, scholars.